Hi, listeners. Welcome to Grief Out Loud. Remember the last time you tried to talk about grief and suddenly everybody left the room? Grief Out Loud is opening up this often avoided conversation because grief is hard enough without having to go through it alone. We bring you a mix of personal stories, tips for supporting children, teens, and yourself, and interviews with professionals in the grief world. Platitude and cliche-free, we promise. Grief Out Loud is hosted by me, Jana Cristofero, and produced by Dougie Center, the National Grief Center for Children and Families in Portland, Oregon. In Griefland, lots of groups of people are talked about as invisible or forgotten or overlooked. Children, parents grieving a miscarriage, ex-partners and spouses, and siblings. With children, at least historically, people thought and hoped that they would just forget the person and not be affected by their absence. With parents grieving a miscarriage, sometimes no one even knows about the loss, and when they do, it can turn into a minefield of platitudes. Things like, well, you can always try again. Former partners and spouses are met with disbelief that they're grieving at all, and they have to weather comments like, we've been split up for so long, why is this even affecting you? For siblings of all ages, the death might be visible and their relationship unquestioned, but their grief still often exists in the shadow of their parents, or at least it's treated that way by other people. Jordon Ferber ran into that when his younger brother Russell died when Russell was 21. While Jordon's parents recognized that he needed support just as much as they did, the rest of his sphere started where most people do, with the question, how are your parents? Jordon used those moments as a chance to teach people that while his parents were in deep grief, he was also in pain and deserved the same support and acknowledgement. Jordon's grief is about to turn 20, and over those years, he's found a way to bring two important parts of himself together. The part that grieves for his brother, and the part that is a professional comedian. This mixing led to the creation of his podcast, Where's the Grief? On his show, he talks with other comedians about death and grief and loss. Jordon is also a longtime facilitator of a grief support group for other siblings through the Compassionate Friends, which is a nationwide support group network for those grieving the death of a child or a sibling. Just a heads up, listeners, that this episode contains some salty language. So if you're listening with younger children, or if you're just not up for hearing that type of language, you might want to skip this one. Okay, here's my interview with Jordon. Jordon, thanks so much for joining me for Grief Out Loud. It's kind of fun. It feels like home talking to someone who is in Brooklyn right now, where my family's from.
Forget about it over here, huh? Yeah. Oh, who's excited to be on Grief Out Loud? I'm already out loud. I might as well bring some of the grief. Oh, hey, oh, sorry. Hard to resist that. With an intro like that, it's hard to resist going into the silly voice.
So listeners, as you can already tell, this might be a little bit different of a Grief Out Loud conversation, as Jordon is also a podcast host and a comedian. So it may not be our sort of standard operating procedures for the conversation today. But Jordon, I do always like to just kind of ground us in what brings people to working in this realm, or, being invested in the realm of grief. And for you, that's the death of your brother. And, it's coming up on 20 years. And I just wonder, what's it like for you to hear that number, 20 years?
It is crazy. It's hard to believe that it's been 20 years. It doesn't feel like 20 years all the time. It feels, I don't know, those first 5 years or so, it felt like it could have been yesterday, every day. And then as time goes on, it doesn't feel like it was yesterday anymore. And the fact that it's coming up on 20, I mean, I can't believe I've almost lived more of my life without him in it than I have with him here. Russell was 21 when he died. So, it's not that far removed. And for some reason, I'm not sure why we do this, but I think that, we put extra weight on these milestone dates than I think is necessary. It's, how we mark time, it's weird to think that the 20-year mark will somehow be more painful than the 19-year mark. But that's just how I think we naturally assign the feelings, to time. But it is weird to think, I I don't know how I'm going to react when I actually hit the 20 year. I feel supremely lucky that I have way more resources available to me right now than I did 15, 20 years ago. So I'm optimistic about how I handle it.
Yeah, it's an interesting point that I don't know if it's just unique to the United States or other countries and communities where we kind of love the multiples of five. Every time we do any sort of celebration, like 5-year, 10-year, 15-year, 20-year, when really, I don't know if our bodies connect as much to those 5-year increments versus, like you said, the 19 years or 17 years.
Yeah.
So it's just interesting. I'm not sure where that came from, but it definitely has become a part of the grief experience of marking those days. And, I know it's been many years since your brother died, but how do you talk about him now? What was he like? How do you describe him?
Well, my brother was, first of all, I really enjoy being able to tell stories where my brother is like, the hero, but I also love telling stories where my brother was kind of a dick. It's, those are some good stories too. But my brother lived more in 21 years than most people I know live in a lifetime. He really did a lot with his life. He was the most charming guy I think I'd ever met or anybody ever knew. At 13 years old, he had a business card that said "the little man with the big mouth," and he had a growth hormone deficiency, so he had to take shots to grow. So when he was 13, he still looked like he was probably about 9. He was really young looking, but he was really savvy. Talked to adults as though they were equals. He was not fazed by whatever society deemed to be the cultural differences or the societal differences between him and other people. He was very open to talking to people like he knew them, and he walked into rooms like he owned it. I always say that he was the type where if you stopped him from wherever he was going, he would question your authority before he would listen to what you were trying to tell him to do.
And were you like him growing up?
We were 3 years apart. I'm the older brother, and I feel like Russell was, Jordon 2.0. He saw all the things that I did and improved upon him. One of the stories I always tell is that, when he was 5 years old, somebody asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up, and he said 8, because that's how old I was. He was very much look up to me. But then as he got a little older, he definitely surpassed me in a lot of ways. I always feel like there was a point where I started living in his shadow rather than the other way around. There was, an interesting dynamic switch in a number of ways. I often talk about how, he was annoyingly good at just about everything. He was the type of kid that you taught him how to do something, and 5 minutes later, he was better than you at it, and would make sure he let you know too. He's definitely pointed out how much better he was than you at it after he just learned.
So he was not humble in his accomplishments.
He was not shy. We both come from the same mother. My mother does not have any opinions. She keeps to herself.
And speaking of your family, how did people in your sphere respond to you and your parents when Russell died?
Well, so one of the things, when you lose a sibling, it's really hard because a lot of the focus is on the parents. There's very little understanding of what I was going through. I think the sibling loss is often the most overlooked of the losses. When Russell died, the number one question I got was, "How's your mother?" Oh my God, your parents must be devastated. I was very lucky that my parents were hyper aware that my experience was different but parallel to theirs, and they really were very conscious of it. They really gave me my own space to do things the way that I did them. And I never allowed other people to say that to me without them understanding. I would always say, yeah, my parents are doing I'm guessing they're doing about as badly as I am. But it was really, I also don't think that my extended family had the same kind of reaction. It seemed to me like life went on as normal for them. There were a couple of weeks where they were able to be a part of the grief experience, but after a certain point, it felt like they didn't affect them the same way it affected me. And I found family events to be very, very difficult because those were the most obvious events that he wasn't there for. Those family events, he would be there, and everyone else's families were intact. I felt very alone and very isolated at a lot of family events. And I found it really hard to talk about what I was going through. That first Thanksgiving after Russell died, I was having a moment. I had to excuse myself from the table to have a little breakdown. And one of my cousins asked me, "What's wrong?" And it was hard to realize that I was going to have to probably be the spokesperson for my grief. And I've gotten better at that. I've made it my job at family events to bring up Russell, to tell Russell stories, to remind people that he was part of the family. And it was weird in the beginning, but I think I at least I've gotten over the embarrassment of it for myself. Like, I'm no longer fazed by it when other people in my family get weirded out by it. I just roll with it. That's what it's going to be. It's a them problem if they're uncomfortable.
And you were in your early 20s when Russell died, and, seeing extended family kind of just move back into their lives. Who did you turn to for support, or who was there for you, if anyone?
It's an interesting question. I really didn't have a lot of people specifically, but I did have a lot of people that were there. I mean, a number of people just didn't get it and drift away, but there were a number of people who didn't get it that at least made the effort to sit with me in the uncomfortableness of it. My parents started going to this self-help support group called the Compassionate Friends, which had a sibling group in the New York chapter when they started going, and they kept letting me know that group existed. It took me about 6 or 7 months before I went to a group, and about a year before I started going with regularity. But that kind of peer support from people who really were going through the same thing, who really got it, was one of the most helpful things. Also, comedy saved my life. Comedians are we expose our vulnerabilities to an audience. And sometimes the stuff that we want to talk about doesn't always necessarily lend itself to the comedy stage, but we're always trying to figure it out. So having a relationship with a lot of comedians who I met a lot of comedians right after my brother died, who that's the only version of me that they knew. They saw, they met the most broken version of me, I would say. And we're not judgmental, and were able to be open with me about things that they were going through, even though they were different. Some of them had substance abuse issues or mental health issues that were related to, things that were totally not related to loss or grief, but that were hard to talk about with people who listened, who cared, and who were not fazed by making inappropriate jokes about it. I also remember my best friend from college. He's not a comedian, but he's very funny and a student of comedy like I was as well. And he came out for the Shiva. He was here for that full week. And I remember one day there was just the two of us sitting around, and he looked at me and he said, "I just have one question. How long before we can start making jokes about this?" And I started laughing immediately because I understood exactly what he meant, which was, how long before we can talk about this the same way we talk about everything else? It's important to have that type of camaraderie and banter with someone who really gets you, who really knows you, who really gets you. And my friend knew my brother. He knew him. They hung out many times. So it was helpful to have some people that still had a connection to that part of my life.
I wanted to go back for a moment to your experience with the Compassionate Friends and being part of the sibling peer support group. And, that it took a couple months before you went. And then you said it took a couple more months before you started going regularly. And do you remember anything about the first time you went to the group and kind of what you thought it was going to be like versus what it actually felt like?
Yeah. First of all, it was like 180-degree difference from what I thought it was going to be versus what it has turned out to be. I initially went to the group because my parents kept mentioning it, and I figured, okay, I'm going to go. It won't be helpful, and we'll never have to talk about this ever again. And the irony is that I now run that group and they don't come. I remember that first group being a bit overwhelming. I don't think I spoke at all, but I do remember hearing people say things that I was like, okay, well, that sounds familiar. So, all right, maybe I'm not crazy for some of the things I'm thinking. All right, well, all right, I get it. And once I started talking there, it's amazing to me how much, sometimes it's emotional and overwhelming to talk about some of this stuff. But the more I talked about it, the more I got used to it, and the more normal it became. That whole idea of trying to find ways to talk about this the same way I talk about everything else, kind of, that's where the seeds for that were planted, in reality, because I was able to do exactly that. There was no judgment in that circle. It was a place where I could make a joke and people would laugh, or I could cry and people would put their arm. It was whatever version of me showed up at that group was always accepted. There was nowhere else in my life where I was able to really talk about what it was like to lose my brother without people trying to find a fix or trying to change the topic. It was really the first place that I started to find a vocabulary for even how I felt. I don't know if I had a real understanding of what my feelings were, how to put them into words, because it was so foreign. It was such an alien experience. I had no idea what that had felt like. And I had no way to talk about it because I had no vocabulary for it. So just finding a place where my loss was acknowledged and validated was huge.
Yeah, it's a big topic of conversation, particularly in our groups for young adults who are like 18 to 40, of like, when do I bring it up and how do I bring it up? And, with meeting friends and new coworkers and just environments where not everybody knows that their person has died and they want to talk about it. And I think sometimes that's the magic of coming to a grief support group, because it's already on the table. You don't have to worry about like, when am I going to bring it up and how's it, you might still be like, how's it going to go? But it's like, oh, the whole reason I'm here is to talk about my grief. And there's like a bit of, relief in that, not trying to figure out where do I get this into the conversation.
For sure. It's hard to find ways for it to be organic and not down a rabbit hole of the abyss,
Right.
And for some reason, when you talk about it with people that are not in the group, when you talk about it with civilians, people get focused on how they died rather than how they lived. And that's not a conversation that I want to have. I'm not going to go over the details of his car accident with anybody, really. That's not a story that I tell about Russell, because that's not a story about his life. And I think in the beginning, it's really hard to recognize that we have the power to dictate how that conversation goes 100% of the time. But it feels so out of control in the beginning that it almost feels like we get slapped in the face with it out of the blue and we don't know how to control it. We don't give ourselves permission really to confidently be, I like to say, being able to make other people really uncomfortable really quickly was not the superpower I envisioned having when I was a child, but it is a power I possess. And I've come to terms with that. I try to use it for good. Sometimes I'm a little snarky, not going to lie, but I think it's important to try to find ways that you can make them teachable moments or at least, if somebody starts to take the conversation in a direction that I'm not willing to go in. It's really simple and easy to say, listen, that's not a conversation that I want to have. I'm not, I'm not comfortable talking about that. Or thank you for asking about my brother. When I'm more comfortable, we can talk more about it or whatever. There's a myriad of ways that you can deflect that and still take ownership of how that story unfolds for you. There's no wrong time to bring it up, because there's really no right time either. I mean, it's going to be weird every time until you get comfortable. That's for me, that's how I have felt about it. When I became comfortable talking about it is when those conversations started to become more comfortable, because I was at ease. And I think that energy transfers. People understand that it puts them at ease to have that conversation when they see that it's not going to be upsetting to you.
So speaking of narratives and having conversations that are maybe uncomfortable, but that you have grown to be more comfortable having, everybody does different things in their grief, and you started a podcast, Where's the Grief, that, started just a little bit after Grief Out Loud did. And I'm curious, like, how did you get to that point? How did you wake up one day and be like, you know what I want to do? I want to put myself out on the airwaves and talk all about my grief with other people.
Well, it's kind of funny how things work out. I felt for a number of years doing comedy and grieving I was leading a double life in a sense. They were parallel, but they did not intersect. I really didn't have any material in my act about my brother. I had no material in my act about my grief. It felt very surreal. In a way, comedy saved my life because it gave me the opportunity to think about all this stuff that was totally unrelated. All this distraction was helpful. And like I said before, talking with other comedians off stage about stuff that I was dealing with allowed them to talk to me about stuff they were dealing with. And there was a nice synergy to that I think bonds. When you talk about heavy topics like that, it really bonds you to people when you open yourself up. So having that part of my life and having the Compassionate Friends group that I was going to, there was so much similarity to the two experiences, despite them being separate. And the podcast thing was really starting to take off. I was listening to a lot of podcasts. It just felt like the right medium for this type of conversation. I really felt a need to meld the two. I felt like I needed to start talking about what I was dealing with. I didn't like the idea of doing. I had written some one-man show stuff and solo show projects that weren't as satisfying as having real conversations. I had started going to the Compassionate Friends National Conference every year. That was a game changer again. You go to a hotel where it's 2,000 people and everybody there is part of our SAD group. It was revelatory to me to be able to have a full immersive experience like that. And the thing that I always say about those conferences is that we get there were a lot of great workshops, but we got our best work done at the bar is the analogy I used, which is an analogy for all the in-between times, the sitting around outside, having a cigarette, late night, having drinks, getting drunk with other bereaved siblings. It's where I found myself again. It's where I was able to connect to parts of myself again. And so I felt it was pretty natural to me to I started talking to other comedians who had experienced similar losses. And I just thought, I wonder if I started a podcast about this, would you be willing to come do this? And I asked a couple people and they were all, it's funny how you ask a comedian, are you available to do this? Oh yeah, everyone I know is dead. Let's do it. It's the same excitement that they bring to any kind of gig. And so I just felt like it was a natural, it really was a very organic process by which I developed it and thought about it. And once I saw there was interest from other comedians to talk about it, I thought, wow, this is really something. And I started doing them. I think I did about a dozen episodes before I put any of them out. I was kind of blown away by how much I was getting out of doing the interviews, because gaining different perspectives and hearing all these different stories and being able to talk about grief where mine wasn't at the center of it was also really helpful. I realized that doing the interviews was a means to itself. The publication of them, putting them out into the world and letting other people listen to them was all gravy. Like it was enough. I was getting enough out of it just by doing the interviews to keep doing them.
Well, you mentioned earlier this idea that when you're talking with people who are grieving versus people who are not grieving, that can be a very different experience. And then also the idea of talking to comedians and talking to non-comedians can also be a very different experience. And I wonder, when those two things come together, like, what is it about talking with another comedian about death, about grief, that's different than any other type of conversation you might have with, say, someone like me who's in the grief world, but I'm not a comedian, or someone who's a comedian? Well, it sounds like from what you said, all comedians are in the grief world, so we'll just leave that part out of it. But what really stands out about that?
I don't know. I don't think there is an answer to that will satisfy everyone. But I do think, comedians are, we're social commentators, we're the philosophers, we are in between every other element of entertainment. You start out doing comedy, and it's hard to make a living doing just comedy. You have to sort of divert. You have to do everything. So we're often doing so much by ourselves to begin with. I find grief to be such a individual and isolating experience. We each are going through it on our own. Even when we have support and people, what we are experiencing is unique to us. Nobody is doing it like us. Even my parents who lost my brother, their experience is completely different. Sets of siblings who have lost a mutual sibling have different experiences. I love comedy so much because the best comedy, you don't need to get the laugh to feel the connection. Sometimes, the bigger the topic, the heavier the topic, the bigger the laugh needs to be. But sometimes you can get an applause break just by telling the truth. And I think that when you go through an experience like that of loss, of really deep loss, the truth is all you have left. You need that. I seek out genuine connection with people. I think there's no substitute for having that type of genuine understanding and respect. Losing people is part of the human experience, and it is, we're none of us gets out alive. We all lose people along the way. The fact that society, in particularly in America, doesn't really allow for us to talk about it openly. I think it's sort of a taboo topic to talk about it. So it lends itself pretty well to comedy, I think. I have a joke in my act right now about how I'm doing jokes about mental health because comedy is the only place where you can actually talk about it. You can't talk about it with your friends. I go to a support group for bereaved siblings, and that's a great sentence that you can use if you ever need to get out of a conversation.
Right. Well, and I was going back to what you said earlier of when Russell first died. It was like landing in a whole new, like on a whole new planet. You're not even sure what this atmosphere is or what to eat or what to drink or where it's safe to go or not safe to go, and didn't have words to express what you were feeling because you weren't even sure what you were feeling. And I think about expression, right? Like artists, the outcome of their expression is a painting or a drawing. And for comedy, the outcome is words, and your currency is words. And so I think there's something so powerful about comedians and writers and poets, and that they're able to take grief and give it voice, put it into words that other people read. And even if they didn't know what they were feeling, now they know what they were feeling because someone else gave voice to it. And I think comedy is just another way of that verbal expression that so many people can go, oh, thank you. That's exactly what I was feeling. I didn't know what I was feeling, and I definitely didn't know how to talk about it.
100%. Yeah, I think that's one of the things that comedy really does is it brings people together with collective understanding. Like, oh boy, I thought I was the only one. That's what I think that at its best, I think that some of the things that the best comedy, you can make the same point without the jokes, but the jokes make them go down a little easier.
I think so many people are surprised when they come to grief support groups at Dougie Center or with compassionate friends, a little surprised and maybe a little unnerved by how much laughter happens there. That those jokes are happening in that environment too, because it's other people get it, and you're not having to be so careful about how we talk about our grief or about our people to like caretake for other people. And then that comedy just becomes a unifier in a way that I think is hard to replicate in outside situations.
Yeah, I think comedy helps to really blend that genuine need to scream at the universe, but find a way to bring people over to what you're talking about. I find it sometimes it makes it easier for us to come to terms with whatever the difficulty is. There are no answers to a lot of this stuff, but feeling like it's a normal part of our existence for me has been a very helpful, really, thing to remind myself of. As hard as this is I'm not the first person to lose my brother. We're really only like 100 years away from a time when people were having 8, 9 kids and hoped that 3 or 4 of them lived to adulthood. So, it's crazy to think that we're looking at this stuff now, and finally giving voice to a lot of this stuff that was previously swept under the rug or just deemed, well, that's just part of life. And yeah, it is. And so is being sad about it. So is being upset about it. So is continually yearning for what can never be again. I think for me that it's important to acknowledge both sides of that.
You said earlier too, that as comedians, you all are, public commentators, observers, philosophers. And I wonder, given the context of where we are right now in the spring of 2022 and having, gone through 2 years of a much more heightened awareness of grief and loss, both loss from death and non-death losses with the pandemic and war and all the things that are happening. And I just wonder, what has it been like for you, or what have you seen or heard in the comedy realm around this? It's like, in a weird way to me, it's like a bigger focus on grief and a not bigger focus on grief. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's been my experience of like, people are like, yeah, we're going to talk about it. No, we're not. Never mind. We're done talking about it.
Yeah, it's like people want to talk about it, but not in depth. It's like, oh, we're going to mention the elephant in the room, and now we're moving on. I think that's for me. That's part of the human experience is looking at that at what's happening and trying to find a way to make it less scary. Because ultimately this the for me the experience of grief and it's so scary in the beginning because you don't know how to deal with it. You think, oh my God, I'm going to feel like this forever. It's hard to get out of our own way when that happens. I think being able to take a step back and realize that I'm one in a long line of people that this has happened to, and I try to be open to the possibility that tomorrow will suck less. And being able to talk to people about it has been the only way for me to convince myself that life will go on at some point.
And with it being, almost 20 years since Russell died, what's one thing that you know now about grief that you're like, oh, I really wish I had known this back in my early 20s when my brother first died?
Well, I wish I would have bought stock in Zoom. That's for sure. I think it's funny. People ask that question a lot, and I don't know if there's an answer because if I don't think I was. I think part of the hardest part about grief is that there are no shortcuts. Like, had I known any of the things that I know now 20 years ago, I would have dismissed it as bullshit. Or I wouldn't have been listening, or I wouldn't have been able to enact it. I talk about this in my group a lot about how there are a lot of concepts that I know and that I understand on an intellectual level that are really hard to enact on an emotional level. And this is like a thing that people say to you all the time. Oh, your brother wouldn't want you feeling this way. Yeah, really? No shit. Like I chose this, but this is how I feel. And I'm going to have to deal with how I feel so that I can try to find a way onto the other side of it. But I'm going to acknowledge how I feel by saying, well, I don't want to feel this way. That's not okay. So I don't think that there was anything that I didn't know 20 years ago that I would have been able to do about it. It wouldn't have sped anything up, certainly. I'm really lucky that my parents didn't insist that I do things a different way. I'm really lucky that they didn't spend all of their time having their own pity party. I was still very much at the forefront of their minds, still very interested in what I was doing, still very supportive of what I was doing, of my comedy career. They've been in my corner the whole time. There's a big thing where sometimes when a child dies, the parents go out of their way to create a shrine for that child. And then there's nothing that represents anything similar for their children who are still here. And it's like, hello. Yeah. I know people that I've met at TCF, at Compassionate Friends, who lost a child, and they go, I didn't even know they had other children. I'm really lucky that I had a lot of those things in place before Russell died, even that I had that relationship with my parents. So I don't know if there is anything that would have made a difference. Everything that I've gone through, I kind of fought against initially, and has turned, like being the leader in the sibling group, like it's definitely 180 degrees from what I thought I was going to be doing. And I'm not a kumbaya guy. I was never going to be a guy sitting in one of those circles talking about my feelings. I remember those first few meetings going to, thinking people were there for 20 years. And like, is that going to be me? That scared the crap out of me. I'm like, is that going to be me? I'm going to be sitting in one of these sad circles 20 years from now. That's not going to be me. Right. I mean, this is my life now? Jesus. And here it is 20 years later. That's what I'm doing. I'm running that group. And it's weird to think how much I've made it a cornerstone of my life, consciously. I've gone out of my way to do so. And I often talk about how, like, it's one of the ways that I managed to keep my relationship with my brother going. It's how I'm able to talk about it with frequency and with comfortability, is because I'm still there. And I'm also hyper aware that it's so important that this group continues to exist, because I don't know where I would be without it. And I don't go to a lot of meetings because I have to talk about my grief anymore. I go because I get to talk about a lot of that stuff, and I get to talk about my brother, and I get to help other people. I get to workshop some jokes here and there.
Well, Jordon, I'm wondering for our listeners now who I'll put all this in the show notes, but for somebody who's, driving in their car right now or out for a walk and they just want to go find your podcast or find some of your comedy work, like where would people go to connect with you?
Yeah, you can go to where'sthegrief.com if you are not internet or podcast savvy, but you can also find it wherever you get your podcasts. It's on iTunes, it's on Spotify, I'm on Stitcher, I'm on, so Android and Apple phones. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Where's the Grief. I just started a YouTube channel as well. Pretty sure you can find it at Where's the Grief Podcast, or just my name, Jordon Ferber, spelled with an O, Jordon, Ferber. And I would be remiss if I also didn't mention my foundation. My family and I started a foundation in my brother's memory. It's called the Russell Ferber Foundation. We have a couple different beneficiaries of the fund, but our main one is a full 2-year scholarship in the pastry program at the Culinary Institute of America, where Russell went to school. And we do a big fundraiser for it every summer. It's usually the last Wednesday in June. It's going to be June 29th this year. This year is our 17th annual fundraiser. And you can go to russellferberfoundation.org to find out more about what we do there. And you can follow Russell Ferber Foundation on Instagram at Russell Ferber Foundation.
Well, thank you so much, Jordon. And listeners, as I mentioned, I'll put all that in the show notes. I'll also link to the Compassionate Friends that we've talked so much about, the National Peer Grief Support Program for parents and caregivers who have had children die, and also for adult siblings who have had siblings die.
They have about, I'm not sure what the number is right now, but there are hundreds of local chapters around the country, and their national website has a chapter locator on it. You could just put your zip code in there and it'll show you what chapters are close by and contact information for the people that run it, so you can find out more about how they're running their meetings right now.
Yeah, and I think it's a lesser known fact about Compassionate Friends that there are these groups for siblings, and what people mostly think parents and caregivers. So I'm really grateful for the work you're doing there. And listeners, I'll also link to an episode of Where's the Grief where Jordon interviewed Brennan Wood, Dougy Center's executive director, about her book, a kid's book about grief. So I'll make sure I'll link to their conversation there.
Awesome.
Yeah. Well, Jordon, thanks for taking time out of your day today to talk with me. And I'm really, I have a lot to think about with all that you shared about comedians and commentary and philosophy about life, and just how true that is, and being the reflectors of loss, which is a part of the human experience. So grateful for the way that you've kind of brought those two worlds together.
Yeah. Thanks so much. I mean, it's been weird to say the least. And really was able to meld those two parts of my life. And it's as weird as it's been very exciting and rewarding to put myself into that position.
Well, thank you again for the work and for your time today. And listeners out there, just really grateful each and every time that you decide to tune in to an episode of Grief Out Loud, or when you share an episode with family or friends. If you want to reach out to me directly, you can email me at griefoutloud@dougy.org. That's DOUGY.org, which is also our website where you can find all of our past episodes, our downloadable resources like tip sheets and activity sheets, and information on where you can find programs similar to Dougy Center where you are currently living. I also want to share some exciting news that Grief Out Loud is supported in part by the Chester Stephan Endowment Fund, so we are grateful for their support and grateful for you. So thanks for listening, and we hope you'll join us again next time.